Well, let's talk about this in some detail with Reese, women's rights advocate, and Gina Loudon, media commentator. Hi there both. Thank you for your time on this one. Right, where should we start here? Reese, abortions are considered a normal medical procedure in Sweden. Should patients be denied it then due to the personal beliefs of medical staff? Is that right or not?
Well, here, let's get some clarity about what's actually happening. It's not that the patients are being denied access to abortions. It's simply that certain women or certain people on the medical staff have decided because performing an abortion would violate their religion or their conscience that they don't want to perform them. That doesn't mean that the other staff, the other thousands of or hundreds of people who work on that medical team aren't capable and able to perform the procedure.
But you've got to be professional, haven't you? I mean, there are some stories here which I don't agree with sometimes. Any journalist, you don't agree with it as a news anchor, but you're not here to give your point of view. You're here to get the story across plainly and do it professionally. I don't say I'm not covering that story because I don't agree with it. I mean, what do you think about that thought?
There is a such thing as religious freedoms, and when you're covering the news, that's one thing, but to actually perform an act, the protection of the right of religious freedom protects you from performing acts that would violate that, and one of those acts would be actually taking the life of a child. And if this woman believes that that's against her religion, then she has to be protected in that right from performing that specific act. It's not unsimilar to people who go to war and or who are drafted to go to war and they don't believe in killing, so they're exempt from serving in the military.
Yeah, I agree, because I think when you have somebody whose job it is to bring life into the world and you're contradicting that by saying they should then end a life, those are contradictory maneuvers. I mean, those two things don't go together in some people's moral conscience. It's sort of different from a lot of different things where we're asking people, you know, hey, if you have this job and maybe it goes against your moral fiber to say you don't want to perform, you know, a certain duty because of your religion, but you know that it's detailed when you start for that employer that you have to perform said duties, and you can say, well, I don't want to perform those duties as they're explained, then you can say, well, then I don't want to go to work for that particular employer. But this is a different kind of a thing, because you're talking literally about contradicting the very job that is bringing a life into the world, which is the job of midwifery. If you look at the term tocological, which is the basic Latin for midwifery, bringing a life into the world, the very definition of abortion is ending a life. So it is literally the very literal interpretation, the very literal decimation of the definition of the job.
I mean, there's a recent case in Sweden. 2 nurses denied midwife jobs for refusing to carry out abortions have lost their legal bid on Thursday. The top European court said, well, hey, we don't think anything particularly wrong has gone here. Basically, they wouldn't take it any further. But of course, some countries have laws allowing abortions. So if we've got members of staff saying they won't do this, there's also this legal side, I suppose, is there that they could be taken to court over it. Is that a worry, Gina, again?
Well, I think that you really have to consider that, you know, there are moral absolutes that are global, that don't necessarily succumb to what any particular culture is doing at any particular time. So we have things like slavery that historically we know were moral absolute. We have things like the Holocaust that we look back on and we go, yes, it may have been someone's job to carry out the ideals of Hitler, for example, but it doesn't make them right. It makes them absolutely wrong. So even though someone was implored to do that job, it was a moral absolute that was absolutely wrong. And so if someone has a problem with this, some people would argue that this is a moral absolute that is absolutely wrong, even if it is in the detail of a job. Very different from saying, for example, the very famous case in the United States where someone refused to make a cake for someone because of a particular sexual orientation. That's a very famous case in the United States. If you are the business... Right. If you are a business owner and you want to operate your business in a certain way, some would say, well, you should have that right as a business owner. If you're an employee of an employer, you should then know your job and you should have to do that. However, those things some people believe are completely transposed when you have a moral absolute that should then transcend what may be politically correct variants of the day. And I think that's what we're talking about here.
Reese, you're an employee. You've employed someone to do a job,
let's make sure that
and they
we're
don't want
clear.
to do part of that job that you've employed them to do. So what do? Do you ask them to go and get another job then, or what?
Let's make sure that we understand the specifics of this case and distinguish it from the case that Gina just mentioned. In the case that Gina just mentioned, there was a person who owned a bakery who decided that they did not want to make a cake for a couple who were homosexual. Now, let's be clear that that baker makes cakes all day, every day, and all they make are baked goods. And so to say, I don't want to bake cakes for gay people who are marrying each other is discriminatory. Why? Because there's nothing different about the cake that you make for a gay person than the cake that you make for a straight person. It's not a sweeter cake. It's not a pinker cake. The colors may be different, but there's nothing that distinguishes those two cakes from one another. There's a married couple and they need a cake, right? And so that's discrimination because you're discriminating against making them a cake specifically on the basis of their orientation. Here's the difference. We have a woman named Elinor Grimmark who decided to take a job as a midwife. She informed not one but two different hospitals before she started there that because of her religious beliefs and her conscience that she was not willing to participate in anything involving an abortion because it offends her religious beliefs and values. That's fine, and she communicated that beforehand, but here's the issue. In Sweden has a law that says women have the right to have access to abortions across the board, across the entire country, and so that's their rule and their law. Because of that law, Ms. Grimmark was saying to her employer, I understand that women have the right to abortion, but I don't personally want to partake in anything that has to deal with them. And she actually said, I'll deal with the women who have had an abortion. I will care for them if they've had one, but I don't want to participate. And because she's a nurse and not a doctor, she wouldn't actually be cutting out a baby. She would actually be administering the pill, the RUIUD form. I don't actually have the correct name, but she would be administering the pill form of abortion, and she was unwilling to do that. So here's the thing. There's a distinction between discriminating against a person as to based on some, feature or their gender or who they decide to sleep with or who they decide to marry, and saying to your employer, because of my religion, I can't do this task, but I'm willing to do everything else. I think Ms. Grimmark actually, that the court got it wrong this time, and that they did infringe upon her rights a bit too much.
Gina, where do you draw the line between things like freedom of religion and personal conviction versus legal demands of society? I mean, should you force individuals to participate in something at the end of the day they consider is wrong, even if the law says they should do it?
Well, I'm not sure if your other guest is an attorney. I'm not an attorney, so I don't know that we can comment on the legal portion of this. But at least as far as U.S. law goes, and as far as I understand it, there's a very distinct difference here. One is that when you are the employer, when you are the owner of the business, you get to decide who you want to provide your goods and services to. That's a very simple thing. It's very different from other types of employee situations where you know what you sign up for. That's a very different thing. For example,
not if you're discriminating on protected classes.
And someone asked me, excuse me, I didn't interrupt you, and I expect you not to interrupt me. If I were a Muslim business owner and someone asked me to, for example, make a ham for someone's event, and I didn't believe in that, or if I were Jewish and someone asked me to make something that was not kosher, those are the sorts of things you might exempt from the obligations of a business owner to do that were outside of their faith. That's what I was talking about. It's not discriminatory. It's religious rights of a business owner to do what they want to do. At least that's the way that I believe in freedom. That's my interpretation, not as a lawyer, but as a citizen of the United States who believes in freedom as a business owner. Now, that's different from someone who is an employee who understands that their allocated duties are as follows. In this particular instance, my understanding is, and I don't know Swedish law, but my understanding is that there was a demarcation that she enumerated that said that I don't want to perform these particular duties based on my faith, and that within Swedish law, that's okay. I'm not an attorney, certainly not a Swedish attorney, But if that's the case, and if that carries in Swedish society, then she should have the right to say that, certainly. And I believe there are moral imperatives, certainly in American law, that we as Americans don't have to participate in certain things that we believe are morally imperative, that we believe are morally wrong. If your employer, even if you've signed up for something that isn't particularly excluded from your contract, and you say, I don't believe this is okay to do. For example, we have sexual harassment cases like this every day, where we say, I don't think this is okay for me to do this. I think it is outside the bounds of my contract for me to do this. And we say, no, I'm not going to do this. I believe it's a moral absolute. I don't want to do this. Then there are court exceptions for that, and those things play themselves out in court. And that's why we have our court system set up the way we do, for those moral absolutes that sometimes need to play themselves out in our court system before we even realize as a society that they are a moral absolute. And we've seen many examples of this in our history. And that's why those things are very important. And so I disagree strongly with your other guests.
Reese, final thought from you then on that one. What do you think? Gina being reasonable there or not?
Kevin, it's a great thing that she's not one of the framers of the Constitution or anyone who's had any role in framing or changing the Constitution since then, because here's the bottom line. Most countries, even if they have religious freedoms, they still require that every person, that their rights are protected up until a certain point, that they don't infringe upon another person's rights. And so to say something like, well, I think a person should be allowed to say, I don't want to serve certain types of guests, that's fine, but when you get to the point of discriminating against protected classes, and yes, I am an attorney, Gina, so I'm going to help you on this. This is a little bit of a legal lesson. You can't discriminate against people for protected class issues such as sex, gender, orientation,
no one's advocating
race,
discrimination here. Let's get that clear.
So remember, we don't interrupt one another. That's your rule. Let's stand by it. Okay. So because we don't discriminate,
when you misquote me, I will interrupt you.
To say that I don't want to bake a cake, for someone based on their orientation. So now when we get back to Ms. Grimmark's case here in Sweden, what we have is the country saying every woman has the right to abortion if that's what she so chooses, but we cannot prevent women who have religious reasons for not wanting to interact with or be a part of performing one to then be economically harmed. Because when we really look at it and we stand back, the real issue is that if Miss Elinor Grimmark cannot work as a midwife, then she's economically harmed. So now we have the issue of access to abortion juxtaposed against religious freedom and access to employment. And we cannot say that women who are wanting to be midwives and do most of the role of midwifery, because the state of Sweden, or because the country of Sweden has combined obstetrics to include abortion, which that's kind of uncommon in from my understanding, that midwifery would also include abortions. But in this country, that's what they're doing. That's uncommon, but because they've combined the two, they've made that a part of a job description that it normally would not entail. And that's the issue that Ms. Elinor is facing. But we should not limit her religious freedom or actually impact her financially based on that.
In DC, Reese Everson, women's rights advocate, and Gina Loud, media commentator there in West Palm Beach. Thank you for being on the programme. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Take care.
You too.